The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, we will be getting started right at 1 o'clock. All right, good afternoon and welcome to the What's New and How to Apply for Wisconsin DNR Urban Nonpoint Source and Stormwater Management Construction Grant. sponsored by the Wisconsin DNR and University of Wisconsin Division of Extension. I am Whitney Presby. I am a natural resources educator based out of Green Bay. I am joined by my colleague Rachel Whitehair, a natural resources educator based out of Wisconsin Rapids. I'd like to welcome Joanna Griffin, the Runoff Management Grants Coordinator, who will be presenting today, as well as Corrine Johnson, the Nonpoint Source Grant Manager with the Wisconsin DNR. We at UW Extension have partnered with the DNR for over 9 years, bringing relevant information to a variety of natural resources, municipal, and other local government professionals, and we are glad to be a part of today's webinar. I'm going to go over a few of the webinar logistics. So your control panel, if you would like to hide or expand the control panel, just simply click on the orange box in the upper left-hand corner. If you are joining us via your computer today and running into any issues with the audio, whether it's a connection or something else, you can simply click on the audio drop box and select the phone call option and follow the instructions for calling in via a cell phone or landline. If you have any questions today about the technology or about the content that we're covering, please feel free to enter your questions in the drop box here and send them our way. Joanna is going to be stopping periodically throughout the webinar, and we will be addressing any of the questions that are applicable to all of the attendees. If you have a specific question on a grant or project that you're working on, we will follow up with you individually. And I just want to note that this webinar is recorded for future reference. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Joanna.
Okay. Welcome to today's Urban Nonpoint Source and Stormwater Construction Grant Program webinar. I will refer to this as the Urban Construction Grant for the rest of the presentation. We are covering the application cycle for calendar year 2021 grant awards. My name is Joanna Griffin, and I am the Runoff Management Grants Program Coordinator at Wisconsin DNR. Listed on this slide is a link to our grant site and to the administrative code that guides the Urban Nonpoint Source grant. The agenda for today's webinar includes an overview of the Urban Construction Grant Program, information about what's changed since last year, and some things to keep in mind as you fill out an application and complete the application process. We'll start off with an overview of the Urban Construction Grant Program. Eligible applicants include cities, villages, towns, counties, regional planning commissions, tribal governments, and special purpose lake, sewer, or sanitary districts. Grantees have 2 years to spend the grant awards. The current cycle will be 2021 through 2022. You may request an extension for a 3rd year. If there's a good reason and funds are available, the request may be granted, though an extension is not guaranteed. In general, the urban construction grants reimburse up to 50% of eligible expenses, up to a maximum award of $150,000 for construction of eligible BMPs that control urban non-point and stormwater runoff pollution from existing urban areas, and for other eligible associated costs and ancillary activities. Urban construction grants reimburse up to 50% of the cost of land acquisition, up to an additional award of $50,000 for land acquisition required for the installation of an eligible BMP constructed as part of the same urban construction grant project. Now let's go into detail about some of these bullet points. Many of the words are defined in statute and/or code. We will return to the slide at various times in the presentation. The Urban Construction Grant Program can reimburse construction of eligible BMPs and associated activities. Let's look at the eligible BMP. For NR 155.151D, eligible BMPs are urban best management practices included in Chapter NR 154, or those that have technical standards developed and disseminated in accordance with Subchapter 5 of Chapter NR 151. This slide lists those BMPs that currently meet this requirement and corresponding technical standards that apply to each. So the BMPs listed on this slide are the BMPs eligible for reimbursement under the Urban Construction Grant. You can find these standards on the DNR website by searching for stormwater and then selecting post-construction standards, which is circled in red on this slide. Details of the standard can be found by clicking on the PDF link located next to each name of each standard. The first BMP on the list is a wet detention pond. This practice is one of the most cost-effective options for achieving pollutant load reductions and is the BMP most commonly proposed in the urban construction grants projects. Keep in mind that these all have quite a bit of text associated with each practice, like shown here. I'm going to go through a few of these, but I will only show the photos. Other BMPs commonly funded by the Urban Construction Program include the Infiltration Basin, covered by Technical Standard 1003, the Bioretention for Infiltration, covered by Technical Standard 1004, Vegetated Swale, covered by Technical Standard 1005, Infiltration Trench, covered by Technical Standard 1007, and Permeable Pavement, covered by Technical Standard 1008. Let's go back to the explanation of the Urban Construction Grant Program. In addition to eligible BMPs, the grant program can also reimburse other eligible associated costs and ancillary activities. Eligible BMPs constructed as part of the Urban Construction Grant Project are eligible. However, urban construction grants are funded with state bond revenue. State bond revenue can only be used to fund engineering of constructed BMPs. This means that we're unable to reimburse the engineering designs until after BMPs are constructed and installed. So even though engineering is the first step of the project, it cannot be reimbursed until the project is complete. Furthermore, if a BMP is designed but never installed for whatever reason, the engineering costs cannot be reimbursed. DNR will only fund one high-efficiency sweeper per municipality. The cost sharing for the sweeper only covers 50% of the incremental difference between the cost of a high-efficiency sweeper and a conventional broom sweeper. So listed on this slide are the other eligible costs and ancillary activities. Another thing to point out about the Urban Construction Grant is that eligible BMPs must control runoff pollution from existing urban areas. Let's look at the definition of existing urban. Per 281.663 Wisconsin Stats, to be considered an existing urban area, the area must have met the definition of urban since on or before October 1st, 2004. The definition of urban can include residential, commercial, and industrial land use, if these land uses meet certain criteria. For urban construction projects, the project area that must meet this definition is the area served by the BMPs. Specifically, residential areas, the population density must correlate to the project area, and the population was determined by the latest census or population estimate. So the population of greater than 1,000 people and an average population density of greater than 1,000 persons per square mile. Commercial land use is also classified as urban. This includes governmental, institutional, transportation, and even recreational uses, if they contain source areas such as parking lots, streets, storage areas, large landscape areas that generate an above average amount of rainfall, runoff volumes, and or pollutant loads. Manufacturing and non-manufacturing industrial source areas are classified as urban. The urban construction grants can fund BMPs that treat runoff from industrial areas not covered by an industrial stormwater discharge permit. Examples of such eligible areas would include employee parking areas or landscaped areas not contaminated with industrial activity. Also, urban construction grants can fund BMPs on islands of land completely surrounded by the urban area types described above. Let's go back to the description of the grant program. Urban construction grants can reimburse up to 50% of eligible expenses. The amount eligible for cost sharing is the amount of the total project costs that are eligible for up to 50% cost share reimbursement. The amount eligible for cost sharing is different than the grant award amount, as the grant award itself is 50% or less of the amount of eligible project costs. Eligible project costs differ from total project costs in that total project costs may include construction of activities not eligible for cost share reimbursement. If we look at the budget table from the application, we see that the header rows of columns B and C ask the applicant to enter the total project cost and the amount eligible for cost sharing. This is the same as the eligible expense. These two columns are sometimes confusing to applicants. The reimbursement award amount is 50% of the amount eligible for cost sharing. In some cases, total project costs equal eligible project costs. This slide lists some examples of situations in which the total project costs are greater than the amount eligible for cost sharing. For example, if a portion of the area served by the eligible BMP does not meet the definition of existing urban development, then only the urban areas of the BMP watershed is eligible for cost sharing. Total project costs versus eligible project costs can be determined by prorating eligible versus ineligible areas served by the BMP. If the eligible BMP is designed to serve both water quality and flood control functions, only the water quality portion of the BMP is eligible for cost sharing. And again, total costs should be prorated accordingly to determine eligible project costs. And for some practices, only the incremental difference between the cost of the typical approach versus the water quality are eligible. For example, this grant program does not provide funding to communities that need a new street sweeper. However, if they decide to purchase a type of street sweeper that can reduce runoff pollution, then the incremental difference between the cost of a new mechanical broom sweeper and a high efficiency sweeper is eligible for cost sharing. Let's look at an example. In this case, the BMP selected is a wet detention pond. Estimated total cost is $100,000. All of that cost is eligible. For DNR cost sharing, see column C, and circled in red. The maximum state share is $50,000, which is 50% of the eligible costs. The requested state share can be up to the maximum state share. Let's return to our explanation of the program description paragraphs. Urban construction is a reimbursement grant program. This means that no money is reimbursed until the grantee has constructed a BMP. Note that there are other important steps in between the DNR issuing grant awards and the final reimbursement request. The grantee is required to submit their professional services agreement and construction plans and specs to the DNR for review before the project is constructed. So DNR issues a grant award. The grantee submits the engineering PSA to DNR for approval. Step 3, DNR issues the approval. Then step 4, the grantee completes the design and pays the engineer. In step 5, the grantee submits the construction plans and specs for DNR review and approval. In step 6, DNR issues the construction plan and spec approval. Then grantee constructs the project and pays in full. Step 8, grantee requests reimbursement of state share amount from DNR. Step 9, the DNR reimburses the grantee state share up to 50%. And then the last step is the grantee receives state share reimbursement. Let's go back to the description. We see in the second bullet that land acquisition is also eligible for cost share reimbursement if land acquisition is required for construction of an eligible BMP. Land acquisition funding is available for projects that also include funding for BMP construction. Land acquisition cannot be a standalone project, and therefore funding is not granted solely for the acquisition of easements or fee title purchase of property. This can take the form of land and fee title or conservation easements. Eligible acquisition costs include appraisals, land surveys, relocation payments, title evidence, recording fees, historical and cultural assessments as required by the DNR, and environmental inspections and assessments. Keep in mind that once a property or easement is purchased through a construction grant, the grantee will hold title to the land and permanently assume all the implied responsibility. An acquisition proposal required as part of the construction application for projects that include land acquisition. The acquisition proposed must include items which are provided in the instructions. These include a map, a schedule, and eligible BMPs that will be constructed on the property. An appraisal is required for any property or easement purchased through a construction grant as part of the project. There are several requirements related to appraisals, which are also detailed in the instructions. So that concludes the overview of the Urban Construction Grant Program. Before we move to part 2, we'll take a pause to see if any questions have come in, and we will answer them.
All right, we have had a few questions come in, and in my fumbling to try to answer them online, I think I've only sent a partial answer, so I want to make sure that I covered this for the whole group's benefit. One of the questions was, are public university campuses eligible if they are required to apply for an MS4 permit? And my answer was, there are provisions in NR 155 that discuss UW campus eligibility. Essentially, the Board of Regents serves as the grantee, or the applicant, I should say. And there's details in that section of code that outline when a UW campus, it's not all campuses, all universities in the state, but public UW campuses essentially could be eligible for a grant if the municipality in which they sit needs or has a MS4 permit and the project is for stormwater control practices. Another question was, villages with a population of less than 1,000 are ineligible, question mark. And the answer to that is yes, that is correct. If a governmental unit has less than 1,000 people, it would not be eligible for an Urban Nonpoint Source grant because it doesn't meet the urban density requirements then. There was a question about renewing, the person said, I missed the earlier slide about renewing the grant. How do we go about that? When you say renew the grant, I'm assuming you mean seek an extension because one-year extensions are allowed in certain cases. What I will say is if you are in the second year of your project and you think you're going to need more time, do not wait till the very end of your grant period to seek an extension, and that needs to be requested to your regional non-point source coordinator, who then submits that to our central office grants team here at DNR. Generally, we like to see extension requests come in at least 2 months before the grant period ends on a given project. Someone said that the link to the construction grant application form doesn't appear to be working. That may be dependent on the browser that you're using. If you're using, we've found that the best browser to use with certain DNR forms is Explorer. I typically prefer Chrome myself, but a lot of DNR forms will not open in Chrome. So I recommend that you try opening that file in Explorer. And if that does not work, then please email Joanna and let us know. But hopefully there aren't others having that same problem, but try the Explorer browser. That's it at this point.
Okay. So let's go through a few examples related to common questions we get about the program. Is a salt storage shed eligible for cost sharing under an urban construction grant? Winter de-icing management is an element of a municipal MS4 permit. To answer this question, we need to remember that according to NR 155.151D, eligible BMPs are urban best management practices included in Chapter NR 154, or those that have technical standards developed and disseminated in accordance with Subchapter 5 of Chapter NR 151. So let's go back and look at the list of eligible BMPs that meet that criteria. We don't see a salt storage shed here. Maybe it's an ancillary activity. No, not there either. Salt storage shed is not eligible. Here's another example. Can I add an aerator to the pond? What if the project didn't cost as much as budgeted and the grant has underspending? Can I use it to put an aerator in the pond? How would we go about figuring out the answer to this question? Remember, eligible BMPs are those constructed according to standards. So let's look at the list of eligible BMPs. If the wet detention pond was the eligible BMP in the grant, we can then refer to the technical standard. So we know from NR 154 that wet detention pond must be designed according to technical standard 1001. The first thing we see is that aerators designed to mix the contents of the pond are prohibited. Second, if an aerator or fountain is desired for visual and other aesthetic effects, they must meet certain requirements. If the pond is designed according to these standards, then the aerator is okay, but the aerator itself may not be an eligible cost if it's for aesthetics. There may be some circumstances where an aerator is eligible. However, in many cases, it will not be eligible. I'll take one more check to see if there are any questions.
Let me go back. I was actually attempting to open up the form myself on the Explorer browser. Let me just toggle back to the question board. And no, there have been no additional questions this time.
Okay, so we'll move on to what's new in the 2020 application cycle.
By the way, the form did just open now in Explorer, so at least for me. So hopefully, we apologize for that inconvenience of having to use a specific browser, but hopefully you can get that to work again using Explorer rather than Chrome or something else.
Yes, and if not, please let us know.
Mm-hmm.
So the Urban Construction Grant application was revised. The content of the instructions has changed to match the new application. The instructions are easier to use and refer to as you complete the application. For example, each and every page of the instructions has a header that indicates the part and question of the application covered on that page. Additionally, instructions are divided into columns. The left has the directions and the right has the explanation. The PDF text is searchable. If you have questions about a topic, you can search for that term. And the table of contents is interactive. You can click on the section of interest and you'll be directed to that part of the instructions. These revisions are intended to clarify commonly misunderstood information and make the application and instructions more user-friendly. The changes overall, for the most part, are not substantive, but rather intended to increase clarity and reduce mistakes and missing information when applicants fill out the form. Minor changes have been made to other sections. Also be aware that the form has programming built in, so that the question and answer options that appear in any given section of the application are based on the answers provided by the applicant on previous questions. Here I have listed areas of the instructions that have changed the most. Part 2, which is project information. Part 3, screening requirements. Part 4.1b, the financial budget table. Part 4.6, evidence of local support. And Part 5, local implementation multiplier. I'm now going to go into some of these sections with a bit more detail, but in most cases, these are just clarifying changes. Under Part 2, project information, you may find the following areas are different. Defining a project location has been clarified. You will now enter location information for each proposed BMP. If the project is to construct multiple BMPs located on the same parcel and in the same Hub 12, working collectively to serve the same source area, you do not need to enter a separate location for each BMP. If the proposed project is to purchase a high-efficiency street sweeper that will sweep areas located in only one Hub 12, enter the midpoint of the area to be swept. If the proposed project is to purchase a high-efficiency street sweeper that will sweep areas spanning multiple Hub 12s, enter location information for each Hub 12 on individual rows. The application now covers multiple Hub 12s. In the past, you needed to fill out multiple applications, and that is not the case now. The BMP entry has moved to the Part 2 project information section of the application to select the BMPs and associated activities, and these will later populate in the budget table. Project area photos are included in this section also. Although they are optional in the application, they are required for the final report if the project has been funded. In Part 3, 3, screening requirements, there is a new section C called location filters. These filters are required for each BMP location entered. So the navigable waters determination and the wetlands waters determination. The property control as well. In Part 4.1b, the financial budget table, the header rows in the budget table will automatically populate with the BMPs, ancillary activities, and other eligible associated costs selected by the applicant in Part 2G. Also, the total maximum state share will be automatically calculated, which is circled here at the bottom. I'm going to take a break and see if we have had any questions come in.
Someone asked the question and I answered it to all. I provided the answer to all. Essentially, I'll just repeat it though. Are private multifamily developers eligible for the grant? And if so, does the municipality apply on our behalf? In a nutshell, the applicant and the grantee must be a local unit of government. So no, private developers are not eligible applicants or grantees. What standards are used to define a high efficiency street sweeper? That is a good question. I think once upon a time we had an actual list of high efficiency models that were common out on the market. I'm not sure that we exactly have a standard per se for that. I can look into that. We can certainly look into that though and get back to you. I'm just reading additional questions. They're coming in a little bit faster. If a municipality has several projects, can they be aggregated on the application if engineering construction resources will be the same for the multiple sites? I think ultimately you're going to want to do a separate application for each site. And if the engineering, the engineering work is the same, you could essentially prorate out that portion of the engineering that is attributed to a given site. We wouldn't be able to lump that together in one application. How much funding is available for the next grant cycle? At a bare minimum, about $1.5 million of bond revenue is available. We are in the process of closing out grants still from the previous grant cycles, and there may be underspending attributed to some projects that will add to that pot of money. But we have an appropriation of bond revenue that is shared with our municipal flood control grant program. We divide that down the middle. And in the current biennium, we were given $3 million in that appropriation, and $1.5 million of that came to the Urban Nonpoint Source construction grant program. Like I said, plus any underspending that is coming from projects that are finishing up. And we won't know that more definitively until probably later in the spring. I think that's it for now. I might try to get some in the next cycle, but I need to kind of process the questions. So go ahead.
Okay. So the last thing on today's webinar agenda is to go over some things to keep in mind as you fill out your application. These topics are what makes a good application. We'll discuss navigable waters and wetlands, NR 154 revisions, identifying and establishing a government authorized representative, and contacting your regional non-point source coordinator to discuss your project. So let's talk about what makes a good application. Write answers in complete sentences. Be specific. So if you can copy and paste the same answer into more than one application, the answer is probably not specific enough to the project. Provide specific, detailed information about the things that are asked about in the questions. But don't overload the application with irrelevant information and attachments. So a good application includes a detailed project budget and schedule. The application should be internally consistent. So each part of the application is consistent with each other. For example, make sure each eligible BMP and other eligible activities for which cost share funding should be described in the project scope, listed as milestones in the project schedule, and listed as major activities in the project budget, with detailed sub-activities for each major activity. The application should include as much detail as possible about the project, including concept level BMPs designs if available. If designs are not yet completed, provide a sketch of the proposed BMPs on an aerial photo. The applicant should have built local support for your project and included documentation of local support by citizens and local government for specific project activities. And it should also include documentation of local share in an existing or proposed budget. Budgeted local share is not the same as local funding source. There's a section of the application that asks for the source of local funding. Here you can answer stormwater utility or general fund, for example, and these would be appropriate answers. However, budgeted local share is something different, actually showing the budget of the funding source with local share budgeted. If you write only stormwater utility or general fund for the local share, budgeted local share, the application won't earn any points for them. So let's talk about navigable water and wetland. The DNR will not fund any urban stormwater practice located in a navigable water or wetland, regardless of whether the practice is being installed to meet a WPDS stormwater permitting requirement. The application is required to consult the information sources listed to answer navigable waters and wetland filter questions on the application. No, you're not required to have a Chapter 30 permit with the application, but if it's clearly non-permittable, don't apply. And if you're not sure, contact the local water management specialist. If the project includes excavation or a purchase of land or easement, the applicant must submit the Environmental Hazards Assessment Form, which is DNR Form 1800-001. If your project is selected for funding, evidence that the unit of government has budgeted for the local share must be submitted in a timely manner. The department will not award a grant without this confirmation. Now we'll talk about NR 154 revisions. NR 154 identifies agricultural best management practices that can be funded under the Notice of Discharge and Targeted Runoff Management Grant Programs. It also identifies the urban best management practices that can be funded under the Urban TMDL, TRIM, Urban Construction, and Urban Planning Grant Programs. And it identifies cost share conditions for BMPs available for funding in the grant programs above. NR 154 was revised to be consistent with recent updates to Chapter ATCP 50. This includes changes in the flat rates for certain BMPs. Also, NR 151 now identifies additional cost-shareable urban BMPs and their technical standards. The proposed rule changes are currently in the legislature. If no hearings are called, we anticipate an effective date of June 1st, 2020. Keep in mind that these are not in effect during the application process, but they should take effect before the grants are awarded. Here is a link to the changes from the June 2019 Natural Resources Board meeting. Remember to identify and establish your government authorized representative. Let's go into this in a little more detail. The authorized responsible government official is the only person that will be able to sign and submit grant agreements, amendment requests, reimbursement claims, and interim and final reports on behalf of the grantee. An executed government responsibility resolution, or GRR, is required to establish an authorized responsible government official. If you don't already have one, you may need to get on an appropriate council or board meeting agenda. The DNR recommends using a job title rather than a name in the authorizing resolution. For example, a city manager or director of public works, so that you don't need to execute a new GRR if and when there is staff turnover. A city engineer is okay as long as the engineer is an employee of the grantee. Consultants and contractors cannot be an authorized responsible government official. As you look again at this figure we discussed earlier in the presentation, note that each of the grantee steps that involve interaction with DNR must be completed by the authorized responsible government official. So think about who in your agency is the best person to fill this role. We are not allowed to accept these from anyone other than the authorized responsible government official. This slide here shows the GRR template to be used by grantees in establishing their authorized responsible government official. The GRR must include the language in the box. And finally, contact your regional non-point source program coordinator early to discuss your project. Don't wait until the week before the application deadline. A week before is the latest. A month or two beforehand is preferred. We want to clarify that contacting your coordinator should include, at a minimum, a discussion of the following subjects: project eligibility, the proposed BMPs, permits and other feasibility issues, and water quality need. Leaving a voicemail or sending an email just before the applications are due is not the same as a discussion. If you're not sure who your DNR non-point source coordinator is, refer to this slide and jot down the name and contact information of the coordinator for your county. I will leave this up for just a minute so you can make sure you've written that down. Okay, so all applications must be postmarked and mailed by April 15th. We'll stop here and see if there are any other questions have come in.
We do have some more questions, and I would actually like to clarify a little bit on what I was saying before about a project where a municipality has several projects and has potentially aggregated engineering and construction resources. I just want to point out, I dove back into the application instructions, and if a municipality has essentially more than one project, and those projects are on contiguous properties under common ownership, we will in essence be considering that as one project. We would be grouping that when considering the maximum award amount. And we also had a question that asked, can a municipality apply for multiple projects, multiple grants? The answer is yes. However, there is a code requirement that limits how much any one grantee or applicant can receive. And essentially, no one applicant can receive more than 20% of the available funding. So again, if you've got multiple projects that are under common ownership or contiguous properties, we would be considering that as one group or one grant or one project. Certainly, a project can have multiple practices as long as you're factoring in that there is a grant cap. So I think that's something also to figure in. It's not uncommon to see potentially two practices on a given grant award, factoring in the cost share rate and the grant cap. Is stream bank restoration along navigable waters eligible? Stream bank restoration is an eligible practice, so take note of that in the application materials. A lot of our projects in the Urban Nonpoint Source Construction Grant Program usually are urban stormwater practices that help achieve compliance with the MS4 permit, but we have funded stream bank restoration as an eligible BMP in the past. Can the GRR call out more than one person? Yes, but you have to be clear in that GRR for a given grant task or grant step who that title, that actual staff title or official title is. You could almost create a table for each grant step, and we have a template again for a GRR, a sample GRR in the instruction document for the grant program application materials. But you would want to be clear for a given grant step who that authorized official would be, and that's fine. How does DNR choose grant winners? Are there evaluation criteria available? All of that information is spelled out in the grant application instructions. I highly recommend anybody that's applying for an Urban Nonpoint Source construction grant to read the application instructions. The scoring criteria, the point breakout is all spelled out in the instructions. And this very much is a scored and ranked and competitive process. So it is in your best interest to understand what those scoring criteria are to create the best application possible and hopefully score the highest. Like I said, if there's more than one application from a given grantee, again, no more than 20% of the total available funds can go to any one grantee. So we would fund projects in rank order based on the scoring criteria. Would the 20% be based on the 1.3 million you mentioned? Yes, it's actually about 1.5 million or more, depending again on underspending that we may have coming from projects closing out. But yes, the 20% is based on the total available funding that we have available at the point of making our funding decisions. question about excavation disturbance along the waterway, is that still eligible? So as I mentioned before, stream bank restoration is still eligible, as a practice in Urban Nonpoint Source grants. However, you do need to obtain necessary DNR permits. In this case, it'd probably be a Chapter 30 waterway permit for the excavation and disturbance work associated with that project. So that does not, by getting a grant, that does not preclude you from having to obtain necessary permits associated with that land disturbance. I've got a question about, do we have any old grant applications to be able to see examples? And the answer to that is, do we ever? If you have a certain kind of project in mind for your municipality and you'd be interested in seeing some sample grant applications, our grant applications that are submitted are public record, but I think it would be best for you to contact your regional nonpoint source coordinator, talk about your project, and we could maybe find some example grant applications from the past that are similar to the type of project that you're proposing to do, rather than kind of guessing at that. So get in touch with your regional nonpoint source coordinator on that. All right, I think that's it for now.
Okay, well, thank you, Joanna and Corrine, for your great insight today. Like I mentioned before we got started, this webinar was recorded, so we will be sending out a link in the upcoming days for reference, or for those who were unable to attend today. Thank you so much for all of your insightful questions and thoughtful questions. We really appreciate you taking time out of your afternoon. Everyone have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.